Welcome to the 12th episode of the Nonstop Podcast with Pooja. With me, I have Harini. Hi, Harini. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi Pooja, thank you for having me here.
And I have to tell a little bit background about Harini. Harini is a very impressive person. She is a doctor who is not just a doctor, but a very fun doctor who is into also sports. We'll talk a bit more about that. But tell us about your journey, how you got into medicine, and the beauty behind medicine, and what you're doing right now.
So I come from a long line of doctors to start with. So I think medicine was like the natural choice of succession for me rather than, a choice that I consciously made, which is how it is in the Indian setup, as you know. So it was more of a duty when I started it out, but then along the way I got introduced to sports medicine, which is where I found my calling. And from there, I did my internship for a year with Basu sir at Primal Patterns, and I was like hooked on to the topic. It's like he just told me you try it out for a couple of months or a year, see if it works for you before you go for your masters. And I was like 1 month, and I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I mean, I don't think I felt that way even about boyfriends or relationships in my life. So that was how much I fell in love with sports medicine. So it was natural. I went on to do my masters at Queen Mary University in London and came back, and somehow RCB landed on a platter for me. So
Yeah,
yes.
but before we talk about the sports medicine journey, it's right for me to ask about the actual, qualifying as a doctor and qualifying in India. Did you do general medicine? What was your sphere of, specialization?
So the thing in India is we don't really need to do pre-med before we get into medical school. It's directly from high school. And when you've completed undergrad, you are considered a general practitioner. So there is no separate GP training or anything. So it's about 5.5 years plus 1 year of an internship period, after which you're just considered a GP. So that's literally where it ended.
And we've had, different kind of guests on the show. And I always have wondered, being a lawyer myself, like what was that one intriguing factor that wanted me to become, a lawyer? So in your case, during your medical journey, whether studying or practicing as a doctor, what is the one intriguing thing that made you feel that you want to pick up to be a doctor?
So, like I said, for me, being a doctor itself was a choice made for me. But then I would maybe pick on an incident for picking on sports medicine as a journey, which was actually where a cricketer that I know, I'm not going to name who they are, came to me during my third year. You know how it is in the Indian setup where you're already in second year and third year of med school, and everyone is like, can you check this report for me? Can you take a look at this and tell me what it is? And you're like clueless because you're a third year and you're like, what am I doing? But then they came to me and they showed me this ECG of theirs. And since my father's a cardiologist, I had a fair share of idea about ECGs and cardiac health in general, because that's something that I've been hearing being discussed about all my life. So compared to most other verticals of medicine, cardiology is something that I'm more familiar with. So from that perspective, I took a look at his ECG and I was actually concerned. I was like, buddy, this does not look good. I think there's something wrong. And he was pretty young. So then I called my dad. I was like, Dad, this is what it is. I think he needs to see you. So there's something wrong. So then my dad was like, I've taken a look at it. He's completely fine. You said he's a cricketer, right? Can you go read up on athlete's heart? And that was my first introduction into this. And I was like, I went back and I did a little bit of reading and I was like, wow, literally wow. Because when I found out the adaptations that an athlete's heart goes through and a lot of the findings that come in it, those are things that can be fatal in a normal person. And here are sports people walking around with it normally and performing at their peak. And that was literally where it changed things for me. And that whole, that curiosity into sports medicine came. So if you ask me for a defining moment, I think that would be it.
Yeah, I think that's very beautifully put. And that's popping a couple of things to my mind, which I need to ask you and address this. So cardiology, right? Like heart health is something that is most commonly spoken about in today's time, which was only known to us on a very surface level, say 20 to 30 years ago. Everyone's getting a heart scan these days, let it be a normal day-to-day person who's not especially an athlete or into any other kinds of specific activities professionally. And I also feel that in terms of even certain things like heart palpitations or like an adrenal rush, and how we react as a normal person versus and how an athlete reacts, because they are under not just a lot of adrenal all the time, but they're also under a lot of intense stress, which also is neurological, which is also connected to heart health, if I'm not wrong. So, what would you say that is the very basic of cardiology or heart health? If somebody who's listening, to the podcast and wondering, okay, if I need to think about cardiology for dummies, and if I have to start off with understanding, what would be the basics?
Wow, that's actually a very interesting question. So, see, if that I would have to approach this question from a general population perspective and an athlete's perspective. So, but for both of them, the first thing that I would say is listen to your body. Your body speaks to you in a lot of ways. So, something that we try to build with athletes itself is this concept of being in sync with your body. And that's something that I think even the general population needs to work in. Whereas when you feel the mildest amount of discomfort, something is wrong. You just know it. You're like, I can't put a finger on it, but there's something wrong. And I think there is a discomfort in my chest. Majority of the time that could just be a gastric condition. You might be having a reflux. But there's just that 10% of chance where it could be something that your heart is going through. And that's not a chance that we want to take in this day and age. So that is one thing that I'll tell to anybody. If you feel like there might be something wrong, just get it checked. It's not going to hurt you to, clear that out of the way rather than, suffering later. And from an athlete's perspective, like you said, yes, they are under a lot of pressure. They are on adrenaline most of the time. And interestingly, we do count on that adrenaline to, push them through pain, push them through a lot of scenarios that normal people probably won't get through. So keeping all of that in mind, it's very easy for these symptoms and those pain markers to get masked, for that symptom to not even come to the surface in an athlete, which is why we recommend that athletes are regularly monitored. There's this thing called pre-participation screening. So before every tournament, they are screened for their, health markers. And that is primarily because of this concept of athlete's heart, where a lot of the symptoms that will probably be a massive chest pain, it's a heart attack level chest pain, in a normal person, they might not even feel it because their heart is adapted to that. With all that level of adrenaline, with all the level of stress and their athletic adaptations. So, yeah.
Yeah. Before we go into a bit more on athlete health and what you actually do in the present scenario, I also would like to ask, people often say, oh, I'm having a chest pain, I'm having a heart attack, and I'm having heart palpitations. These are things that are very prone to us today. So if you have to tell us in very simple terminologies, how would you classify, a feeling of an anxiety to a feeling of pain to a feeling of an attack?
Oh, wow. I think this is a very typical Viva question from exams. No, so they tend to overlap, if I'm being very honest.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you might just feel like your heart is beating very fast when you're, just to put it in layman terms, your heart rate has gone up when you're feeling anxious. But can that be felt in case of a heart attack, or in some cases we can call it maybe a fibrillation, or there's or tachycardia itself. So these are all things that are pathological, but you can also feel it in an anxiety situation. So where you need to differentiate it is to see if you've got any other symptoms along with it. Was that particular episode triggered by some kind of a thought process? Did something scare you in that minute? But does that mean that just because something scared you in that minute, it's not cardiac? So all of these are very tricky. If I'm being very honest, it's not something that we can demarcate and say that, okay, if you've got A, B, C, it's just an anxiety episode, or if you've got these particular symptoms, it's probably gastritis, which is where it becomes, it's a gray area. So only thing I would say is, if you are in doubt, better get it checked. There is never a harm to just get it. At least go to a GP, get it auscultated, get your BP checked, get your pulse checked, because we can tell a lot from just the way that your pulse moves, the volume of your blood, the way the heartbeat is moving. It can tell a lot. You don't even have to go to the extent of getting an investigation done, an ECG or an echo done. Just get a GP to get you checked. It's the safest.
Yeah, and we've heard also, there are various causes to a heart attack or a chest pain, and most probably the one that we commonly know is stress, right?
Yes.
But the other determining factor is also food. And it's a huge lifestyle choice that we make based on our diet, based on our location. So, what would you say is today's terms of a pathological poison in terms of food that could potentially lead to a heart condition?
See, one of the biggest factors that could lead to a heart condition, which is, I think, the biggest issue in the world right now, is obesity. So, just being conscious about being healthy, because we do have so much of language dialogue that is going around body positivity. But with body positivity, are we subtly encouraging unhealthy habits? Like, of course, we do not want to, term anybody as fat or thin or obese, or, we don't want to do that. But we need to be self-conscious, introspective about, are we within the healthy parameters? You don't need to be, say, a certain figure. You don't need to be a size 0. That's not what we're talking about at all. But we just need to be conscious that we're having the right nutrients that the body requires. We should be conscious about taking the right fats. Even with fats, are we taking the right fats? Oh no, we shouldn't, I would say, overdo it.
Yeah.
Would be the right term. We just need to be conscious about staying within a healthy BMI, staying within healthy parameters for whatever your height and your weight is. Compare that and you get your BMI. So staying somewhere between 20 and 25 on the BMI scale, that's a very reasonable ask. We're not looking at developing a six-pack or, being so super skinny, becoming a Victoria's Secret model. That's not what we want.
Yeah.
So as long as we keep those healthy parameters in check and healthy habits in check, I think we can overcome most of the risk factors.
Yeah, and I also think I'm reading a book now. It's called Dirty Genes. And it's by one of these doctors that I came across. And he talks about how your genes, which we inherit like in tens, but in hundreds, is in your body. And not all genes are necessarily good ones. And there are some dirty ones.
Yes.
And of course, food can fix it. Lifestyle choices can fix it. And also another scenario where I've been reading on this PhD research by this lady on Instagram, very famously called the Glucose Goddess. I also see that a lot of research in today's time, even athletes are constantly monitoring their blood levels, their blood sugar levels, their, other aspects that really monitor or like impact their well-being. So what is your take on it? Can I put on a patch which necessarily, guides my sugar levels? Do I need to do it? Is that the right thing? Or everybody has a sugar spike, in the morning. It's a very well-known fact, right? Like we're in India, we're in a part of the region where our breakfast is very savory. And I mean, there are people who prefer, like a more like sweeter breakfast, even if it's like a natural source of sugar. How important is this monetization of monitoring the blood sugar levels? Should a normal person be doing it, and versus what an athlete does it?
So CGM patches, basically, those are something that I am actively using for the athletes that I work with. But if you ask me about the values that come out of CGM patches, they're not 100% accurate. They're not the same as doing a blood test in a clinical setting. So what I would suggest for it would be to use it as a guidance system rather than, depending on it entirely to regulate what food you're taking. So it's more about, okay, you're in that ballpark. And you also need to monitor yourself using a CGM patch for a while to understand the way your body reacts. Because, see, for some people, they're going to wake up in the morning and they're going to be in a hypoglycemic value, wherein their blood sugars have dropped really bad. And for those people, they will develop a sugar craving. They are going to want that carbohydrate. That's like their body's mechanism to replenish that energy that they've lost. So from that perspective, does your body need that? A lot of people will probably just wake up feeling just fine. Their sugar levels are just fine. So for those people, they don't really have that kind of craving. Like for me, for example, I don't even crave breakfast. So somehow my body's got enough energy stored that's just, coming back up to the surface. It doesn't really look for it. So from that perspective, understand how your body is working. So that's what I would suggest using all this tech for. To understand how your body is working. You've got the, those rings, you've got the Aura rings or the Ultra Human rings. There's so many brands that are there. Those also, that with the CGM patch gives you a lot more metabolic values. It gives you how your heart is working. All of this is available, but it's not something that I would suggest being dependent on. use that to understand your body. Like I said, getting in sync with your body, you can use that tech to get in sync with your body. But once you're done with that, once you've understood how your body operates, don't depend on those values.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a very twisted concept, right?
Yeah.
Heart health, and also in terms of like sugar levels, and in terms of like vitamins, in terms of nutrients, all of that is very correlated. If you have to tell us very briefly, and also we have to deep dive into the fact of sports medicine, right? If you have to tell very briefly, what do you think is the sports science behind this? If you're talking from an athletic perspective, an athlete perspective, what's the sports science behind this?
Behind heart health itself.
Yes.
So, see, like I said, the way an athlete's physiology works is completely different from the way a normal person's physiology works. In a lot of ways, like their heart rate baselines are much lower than so we'd probably be at 80 to 85 beats per minute. I've seen athletes whose normal is at 56 beats. I mean, if that's going to be for a normal person, that's a very, very morbid condition. That's something that we have to be worried about. So when we have that kind of a situation, something that we work on is creating those baselines. Keep tracking their blood markers, keep tracking their fitness parameters. Create that baseline so you know what is normal for this person. And something like CGM trackers, something like rings, helps us create all of that. So it's like a very beautiful collaborative effort. When we put all of that together and we know that this is the normal for this person, and we understand that that's their body, that helps them also keep track. So that's literally where that whole health perspective for them comes from. We can't just determine it based on how a normal person would react, Yeah,
and also this is a podcast for women, and I also invite very impressive people, and you're very impressive, and you should also tell us that you went from being a clinical medical practitioner to sports medicine, and you now work with athletes, and you tour with women's cricket team of India at the highest national level. You work with some of the most important Indian women cricket athletes, and you're also part of one of the biggest Premier League teams as an internal doctor that helps the athletes. How is this journey of working with women athletes? And I'm sure there comes a lot of stereotype on, of course, in terms of body, in terms of abilities, we are very differently able to just like men's research, right? How have you adapted yourself to working with women and in cricket in general? It's a very specific sport. People do think cricket agility and power and all of that is a very small part of cricket. But in today's the terminologies of cricket, everything has become a shorter format, and everyone expects to really be faster, mobile, agile. So what would you say is the drastic difference in working with women and women cricketers in general?
So if I'm being honest, when I went into women's cricket for the first time, I was originally working in men's cricket, and then when I moved into women's cricket for the first time, I did not know what to expect. Because like every other Indian, I've probably just watched men's cricket all my life. I knew only one or two names within the women's world. So literally everyone was new. What to expect was new. Like I knew the fundamental science of it, but working with a woman is very different. So one of the major shifts that I saw was probably how they approach things. So for men, it's like, hand me the facts. Just tell me this is this, that's it. For women, it's a lot about building that connection. And I think that's so much more beautiful, because within even a team culture, building that connection is what brings out the best in each player. And as a doctor, building that connection makes the player trust me. So, that's just the most important factor when it comes to women's sport. And when it comes to the performance of things, I think women's cricket has started surprising all of us.
Yeah.
Because, like, if I'm being factual, the weight of a women's cricket ball is much lesser than that of a men's cricket. The boundary size is lesser. So, like, everything is built around, the women physique. But then, despite all of that, you see women smashing the ball into the stands. I mean, it doesn't matter what size of a boundary you set in if they're going to be smashing things into the stands. So you see that kind of power being generated, and you see the kind of dedication that they bring in. Because I think the world is shifting towards women's sport right now, and women are ready to hog that limelight as much as possible. So what has now become from a passion project to a profession for men is still a passion project for women. So you can see that in every single female athlete's face. So that is the biggest difference. And I think that's what makes the job worth it.
Yeah. And yeah, like all good things come to an end. I have a couple of more topics to dive with you. But one of the topics that I was very interested to ask and discuss with you is, what is a specific trend on sports medicine as of today? And what is that theory that in today's time that you relate to the most with sports medicine?
So something that is a trend in the sports science industry itself, not just sports medicine, especially after the Olympics this year, would be transgenders or the LGBTQ community in sports. So how to address them? How do we involve them into, the various arenas of sport, or where do we classify them? There's so much of debate about it. And I think the IOC itself is coming up with guidelines for how we do this, but still it's a gray area. So that is something that interests me a lot, where I'm like trying to understand from a physiological perspective, from how we handle them as athletes. I think it's just the same. It makes no difference. But I think it's more about classifications. It's more about, what is fair and what is unfair. So that's a highly controversial, debatable topic that I think we can put an entire episode to. But that's just something that is very personal to me that, I find interesting.
Yeah. And as a end to every podcast of mine, I try to end it on a lighter note. And this happens to be the most heavy question to all my guests, because it becomes personal, it becomes special, it becomes intriguing, it becomes deep. But to you, in a very escalating manner, I have to ask, of course, you are a big bibliophile, right?
Yes.
And I know that.
Yes.
And I picked up to read, and I haven't read so much, but I still have things that changed my life. What is that one book that changed your life? And I generally ask people, what's the one movie that changed your life? But to you, because you're a doctor, and I need to take as much as information I can from you and to provide it to the podcast, I would ask, what's the one thing in life, let it be medicine, vitamin, exercise, the one thing that you feel a human body needs and that you follow by the Bible, by the T. So what's that one thing, and what's the one book that changed you?
Lovely. Okay. So the one book, now this was something that I really need to think about, but I would say one author would be Jeffrey Archer. I think all of his books have, an impact on me, because I am someone who likes to read between the lines. I don't read self-help. I don't like to read long books on, how to do business or how to do something in your life. For me, Jeffrey Archer's book is like a guideline to all of that. And of his books, I would say As the Crow Flies is this beautiful book where, for someone like me, it was a Bible to business. That's actually a very interesting perspective, because I don't know how many people look at a fiction book like that. So this is one book which talks about this guy who takes a very normal grocery business and converts it into this massive multi-billion-dollar industry, which ends up becoming a supermarket that sells everything from apples to an Apple laptop to cars. That's what that journey is about. That's what the book is about. And for me, that was like, wow. That was like this different perspective into how can we approach things in life. And that could be just anything, approaching a meeting, approaching a patient, approaching business itself. So that for me is something that changed my life. And for a thing that I think everybody should follow is something that I wish I follow. It's not something that I do, is get 8 hours of sleep. I swear. That's I think this generation is lacking that a lot.
And you have to tell, if you have to scare people who are listening to this in a very medical terminology of, if they don't get sleep, what is the worst thing that can happen?
Okay, now, if you don't get sleep at all, you can actually die from that. Okay. It's possible. But I mean, getting less sleep is still going to lead to all of those risk factors that we discussed in the beginning about heart health. Getting less sleep can still trigger all of that, including obesity. So, yes.
So they always say we have to end things in a good note, but in this time I have end things in a very suspectable and very scary note. But get your sleep.
Yes.
And thank you so much, Harini, for joining us. And this is a very special episode. It's 1 year since I started the podcast. You're the 12th wonderful woman that I spoke to.
I am honored. Thank you.
And it was very powerful, and I wish you the very best. And thank you for joining with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pooja.